What I'd like to do is talk to you for about 20 minutes about the book I've just written. And this is a thinly disguised piece of propaganda designed to encourage you to purchase the book. But I think making it primarily propaganda is wrong. We'll focus on the issues at stake. But if you have any doubts, I have one more kid going to college. And the money from this, the royalties will go directly into the Alexander Ellis College Fund, so it will go to a good cause. I want to tell you a story in the 30 minutes that I have. It's one of the most familiar stories in American history. It's been told by virtually every generation of historians. It's the subject of one of the more popular plays in the late 20th century, the play 1776, which gets a lot of things wrong, but still is dramatically very evocative. Each generation seems to me to almost be like hanging a new layer of wallpaper over the wall. And so there's been like 20 levels and layers. And part of my function in doing the work for this book was to strip away those layers and get back to the wall itself. And so while I think I've discovered a couple of things that are fresh, if not totally original, I've also discovered things that are so old that people have forgotten them. So I think it's a story that will be different from the one you think you know. I came to the task with an assumption and a question. The assumption was that the American Revolution is an event which, how to put it, looks almost inevitable from our perspective in the present, but in the context of the time is one of the most improbable events in American history. And recovering the improbability of it all, the improvisational character of the decision-making that was going on in the late spring and summer of '76, if you will, finding a way to make clear and cogent what is inherently confusion. Revolutions are almost by definition traumatic events that no one at the time quite understands when they're happening, and in some ways we never ever understand it afterwards either. So telling a story about an improvisational act where people are making it up on the run and improvising on the edge of catastrophe, that's what the book is about. The claim of originality, we all have to be original, is based on the assumption or the claim that there are two stories going on here. One is a political story. The center of that political story is the Continental Congress, and the end result is the Declaration of Independence. By the way, why do we celebrate the 4th? What happened on the 4th? It's about ready to come up again, right? It comes around every year, doesn't it? And there's a famous painting that original hangs in the rotunda of the Capitol that's called The Declaration of Independence by John Trumbull. You listen to this, Jasper, okay? And because you will know more than anybody else. And if you Google it, it says, John Trumbull, Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776. And it shows 5 guys, 5 deadweight male guys, 3 of them recognizable, Adams, Jefferson, and Franklin, coming up to a desk, okay? It's not July 4th. It's June 28th. It's the committee reporting the draft of the Declaration to the full Congress, okay? Adams writes to Abigail on July 3rd and says, "Yesterday, beloved, will be the day celebrated as the anniversary of American independence forever and ever. There will be speeches, there will be parades, there will be illuminations." He gets everything right, right down to the fireworks. He gets the day wrong. Why does he think it's July 2nd? Because that's the day the Congress voted on the resolution for independence. It was a resolution from Virginia that these colonies are independent states. He thought that would be the day. So what happened on the 4th? Nothing. they sent it to the printer. And the printer put July 4th on the first part, on the first thing that was sent out. Now, the world didn't hear about this for weeks. You know, Washington down in New York, he didn't hear about it until the 9th or 10th. But it shouldn't be the 4th. It shouldn't be the 4th. I have this theory that both Adams and Jefferson, recognizing this chronological flaw, decided to make it come out right by dying on July 4th, 1826, 50 years to the day after that. Thoreau went to Walden on July 4th. Lee retreated from Gettysburg on July 4th. And so it becomes a big, actually we hear about the purchase of Louisiana for the first time on July 4th. So it becomes a big deal. I said I had an assumption and a question. Here's the question. I call it the Wilkes-Barre question. Wilkes-Barre, anybody from Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania here? The population of Northern Virginia, of Virginia, I'm from Northern Virginia, by the way, and raised in Alexandria, went to Gonzaga. The population of Virginia in 1776, the white population, was about half the size of the current population of Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. Now, if we go to Wilkes-Barre today and we search assiduously, do you think we can find George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, George Mason, Patrick Henry, John Marshall, Thomas Jefferson? We're not going to find them. Now, theoretically, they're there, latently, but they will not come to the surface. Well, what brought them to the surface in the summer of '76? What was the reason why you get this leadership at this moment? And look, I'm not, they're not icons, they're not demigods, they're all imperfect human beings, but it's the greatest generation of political leadership in American history. This is the greatest generation. I'm sorry, Mr. Brokaw, but this is really the greatest generation. I don't know the answer to that question. I have hints, and here is one anecdote that gets at it. When Washington decided to go to the Continental Congress in May of 1775, he left Mount Vernon. He was wearing his military uniform. This is actually a statement that we're ready to go to war. But we're over a year away from declaring independence at that stage, okay? It's May of '75. And he gives instructions to his manager, Lund Washington, his second cousin. He says, Lund, when the British come up the Potomac, not if, but when, get out my books and Martha, presumably not in that order. He assumed he was going to lose everything. He assumed they were going to burn Mount Vernon to the ground. And there wasn't anything you could do to stop him. 4 years later, in '79, a British frigate actually comes up the Potomac and anchors off of Mount Vernon. And Lund sends out a skiff with gifts and food to appease the British captain. And the captain says, I'm just fishing for herring. And so Lund writes this back to Washington and says, this is what happened. And Washington writes back to Lund and says, I am extremely upset. You have sullied my honor. You have undermined my character. The next time it happens, let them burn it to the ground. Okay? That is what we're dealing with here. That's the level of commitment that is occurring at this moment. in history. We are accustomed to having national political figures have to sacrifice their whole privacy. God knows why the hell they ever want to do this. I can't imagine ever doing it myself to hold that. But this is more than that. When Jefferson wrote the magic words a few months later, their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor, that wasn't just rhetorical. That was an honest statement of what they were doing, okay? All right, I'm going to stay within my allotted time. I've got to really go quickly here. But we will have as much time for questions as you want. One thing that I came away with on the basis of the research for this book was a fresh sense that the American Revolution was eminently avoidable. The answer to a diplomatic resolution of the constitutional crisis in the 75-76 was clear to both sides. Edmund Burke saw it. William Pitt saw it. Thomas Jefferson saw it. John Dickinson saw it. It was absolutely clear. What we have to do is simply say, okay, let the colonial legislatures legislate and tax for themselves, but they remain in the empire under the king and under the Navigation Acts voluntarily because it benefits them economically to remain in this imperial economy. They had proposed that. The colonists proposed it. George III didn't even read it. It was, and the British decided to militarize. How are you? I got to tell you, I got them all over the place here. And the British decided to go to war. Why did they decide that? Well, the great British jurist, William Blackstone, had in 1765 issued the statement that every empire has to have a single source of sovereignty. We cannot have multiple sovereignties. We can't have multiple gods. Well, actually we can, but the Greeks had that. But so you can't allow each of these colonial legislatures to be sovereign. So there's a constitutional statement on this. Secondly, it's a British version of the domino theory. If we let the Americans get away with this, what happens to Ireland? What happens to Scotland? What happens to India? We don't want that. And finally, why do we have to compromise? We have the most powerful army and navy in the world. Its army is not as powerful as Prussia's or France's, but you put the army and the navy together, and they're the most powerful military force on the planet. All we got to do is squash them. And that's what they decide to do. In the early spring of '76, and they decide to send 42,000 troops. This city of Philadelphia is only 30,000. It's bigger than the biggest American city at the time. 42,000 troops, 157 ships, the largest amphibious force ever to cross the Atlantic to crush this rebellion at its nub, at its beginning. If you want to know why the Americans decide to go to independence, up until early spring, while Massachusetts is ready to rock and roll, okay, they are, because they're occupied and it's already been a military conflict there. The rest of the colonies, though, especially in Pennsylvania and New York and to some extent South Carolina, there is enormous reluctance. 2/3 of the Continental Congress are moderates. They believe that our cause is right. We don't want to allow the British to continue to impose these taxes and duties on us. But war with Great Britain is suicidal. Any way we can avoid that, let's do it. And that's what they keep trying for. Enormous reluctance. What changes everything is when the British say, we're going to invade you. We're going to send 42,000 troops and we're going to take New York. There's a resolution sent out in May 15th of 1776. Adams writes it. Adams thinks, therefore, it's the real Declaration of Independence, which he should get credit for, and there's some truth to this. It asks each colony to decide whether to rewrite their constitutions from colonial constitutions to state. Well, if you're going to decide to do that, that's pretty means that you're committed, okay? They send this to every colony. We have, this is what's been forgotten. We have, based on documents recovered, saved back in the 1830s and 40s, because they were the last generation to remember this. Every, like say, Massachusetts got 42 towns. Every town responded. All of them save one out there on the Cape, which said, the British Navy is too, they all said the same thing. We're going to rewrite the Constitution. We cannot believe we are saying this because only 6 months earlier we regarded war with Great Britain as absolutely impossible to imagine. We have no choice. They have already declared their independence of us. It's not a constitutional issue anymore. It's a military issue. And people are being killed. The Battle of Bunker Hill has happened. Okay? 2,200 British soldiers go up the hill, only 1,000 come down. General Howe has a staff of 6 people, including a manservant, who carries a decanter of brandy with him up the hill. He thinks it's going to be a cakewalk. They are all wiped out. He's not touched. He's like Washington. All these bullets go past him and never gets killed. By the way, when they make the movie about this, which I'm hoping for, he starts an affair with this woman called Loring, Betsy Loring, the Cleopatra of the American Revolution, although she's on the wrong side. Blonde bombshell. We got to get the right person. Angelina Jolie, I don't know. And who do you think? Anyway. Another thing that I came to understand that I didn't is, and I got to end soon because we keep it in the time, and even though this doesn't get us to, it's really hard to build an army de novo. You think about it, all these rules, all these, where the latrines belong, how do you promote people, rules. The Continental Army is a work in progress, and it's a bunch of amateurs. The average experience of a soldier in the Continental Army was less than 6 months. The average experience of a soldier in the British Army was 7 years, and the officer corps was even worse than that. They had no chance militarily. And the decision to defend New York, totally bizarre. If you take a look at a map, New York is an archipelago. It's 3 islands, Staten Island, Long Island, and Manhattan. Whoever controls the seas controls the battle. No question who's going to control the seas. So the book describes the Battle of Long Island, the Battle of Manhattan, total humiliation for the American side. Washington starts with 28,000. About 15,000 of those are militia. He ends up with 4,000. He escapes off of Long Island in what is an early version of Dunkirk on August 30th, 76. It's the most important battle in the war, says me. More important than crossing the Delaware. That's another river. Okay, yeah. Because if he doesn't do it, the army is annihilated. What happens to the cause of independence if General Washington, his entire staff, and his entire army is killed or captured in August of 76? Adams says, it's okay, we just raise another army. But, we got 150,000 males between 15 and 50. We can raise another. That's what Ho Chi Minh said to us in South Vietnam, too. Washington learned a lesson from his difficult experience here. Washington began the war. We saw this honor-driven man a little earlier. He thought if General Howe presents himself, he is honor-bound, Washington, to respond. It's like a summons to duel. Okay? So there's a chivalric sense of honor prevalent in 18th century military mentality here. And if you think about it, you know, when these two lines come up in the middle of a field and they raise their muskets and they stand and they fire at each other, why don't they lie down? Why would they get disemboweled and have their heads blown off standing straight up? Not honorable. Not honorable. Why won't they retreat? Not honorable. Stupid. Anyway, Washington comes to understand, and it's hard for him. It goes against all his instincts, that if he competes against the British Army and Navy on equal terms, he's going to lose. Therefore, there's an insight that comes to him. Now, if you think about it, many of the great generals of world history all end up losers. Hannibal, Napoleon, Robert E. Lee, Rommel, they all lost. Washington wasn't nearly as good a general as any one of those, tactically. He lost a lot of battles, but he had an insight that was strategic. He didn't have to win. The British had to win. That means all I've got to do is keep the army intact. There is no strategic center to the rebellion like Boston, New York, Philadelphia. They capture all those places. The strategic center of the rebellion is the Continental Army. And if I can keep the Continental Army alive and fight what they call a war of posts, it's not really guerrilla war because it's a conventional army, then that we will succeed. And that's what happens. And he comes to that insight in the wake of his failures in the summer of 1776. Again, it's really hard for him. Last thought, which it doesn't have anything directly to do with this issue, but it comes out of it for me. This woman that's the op-ed editor at the LA Times asked me, she loves me for whatever reason, and she asked me when we were ratcheting it up in Iraq, she says, Joe, I want you to write a piece on what George Washington would say about Iraq. So I said, Stephanie, George Washington wouldn't know where Iraq was, okay? And Iraq, you know, and he wouldn't know about weapons of mass destruction. He wouldn't know about jihad or all that. And she said, yeah, just write the piece, you know. And so I wrote a piece, and the basic point I made is that I share with you. Washington would have said, we've become the British. We've become the imperial power. And he would have a very difficult time understanding that. If you ask the vast majority of American citizens whether or not the United States is an empire, they all say no. Ask anybody else in the world, okay? And they all say yes. I think that our experience in Southeast Asia and then in Iraq gives us a perspective on the British dilemma in the Revolutionary War. And so in the end, I conclude, whereas most people have said, how in heaven's name did a ragtag group of amateur soldiers defeat the greatest military power on the planet, the real issue is, did the British ever really have a chance? I don't think they did. Thank you very much.
My name is Barry. Before I ask my question, something regarding the Pennsylvania, Virginia, the Wilkes-Barre, Virginia thing. I read recently that because all the excitement happened in Massachusetts, Adams intentionally wanted to bring more Virginia people in. That's why he had Jefferson write the Declaration. Because
why he nominated Washington to be commander-in-chief.
Right,
too.
so this is another reason
That's true.
why.
That's true.
That's right.
That's absolutely correct.
Yeah. Now, reading your one of your books on Washington, you attribute a lot of his experience in the French and Indian War. And so here he is someone on both sides. He was part of the British Army. He understood, and maybe that also was in the back of his head?
One of his problems, in the French and Indian War, he had a sort of near-death experience at the Battle of the Monongahela,
Right.
and he had 3 horses shot out from under him, 7 bullet holes through his coat. That's where he sort of figured out he was immortal. But he never commanded larger than a regiment, 1,000 men, and Washington was not good when he could see everything on the ground in visual sight. He was okay. When the battle was going on out of his sight, he wasn't very good. Most of his offensive operations in the Revolutionary War were too complicated. He didn't have an army capable of. If he had the British Army working for him, maybe so, but he didn't have that. Okay, he was working with a defective weapon, if you will. I think that his resilience is his major asset, not his tactical brilliance, and his insight, as I tried to say strategically. That in the end, to win the war, he didn't. The only way he could lose the war was by trying to win it. That's an irony, isn't it? Yeah.
This is one of those what-if alternative reality questions.
Okay.
You said
Historians don't like that, but they should, because it's fun to talk about, you know.
You said the revolution was far from inevitable. So, supposing hypothetically there was no revolution, that they worked things out.
Yeah.
There might very well not have been a French Revolution because of the close connection between the two. French Revolution is a determining event of modern history.
Well, actually, there's a specific reason, too, why that you're not even aware of, I think. That one of the reasons the French Revolution happens is because the French are bankrupt. And they're bankrupt because they've given us, about 150 million livres.
Yes.
And they have to call the Estates General in order to recover that. It's an interesting problem. Another thing that would if we had gone to a version of the British Commonwealth in 1776, 100 years early, what happens to slavery? Because the Brits end slavery in 1831. I think the South would have seceded from the British Empire if that happened. But the whole history of the Civil War and everything else would have been quite different as a result. What about Native Americans? The British would have protected them for a longer period of time because they had a supposed, a proclamation saying you couldn't go out there. There wasn't any way they can control the demographic spread of the American citizenry across the Alleghenies, but they would have slowed it. It would have still been Indian removal. It would have taken another 50 years.
I was wondering, you've written about so many really interesting figures, and I was wondering if you had a favorite person to write about or to research?
Yeah, Adams.
Really?
Abigail and John both, really. I mean, they're the most revealing, because when you're reading them, you're reading the letters that are really candid and personal, and they bring to life. Washington's correspondence is pretty boring. He was boring. He's a flat person. I mean, if you sat him down for a beer, he wouldn't talk to you. Franklin would be great to bring back. He would be good too. But I would like Adams, and we'll toast everything with a Sam Adams beer. That would be the guy. I'm working on the next book. I mean, and the guy whose stock is going to go up, I predict, over the next few years, is John Jay. Jay's papers have never been published, and they're starting to come out now. UVA. Columbia sort of controlled them in some kind of crazy way. And his letters are very good. His wife, Sarah Livingston, is very interesting. He is very... Back then, he was regarded as an equal with Jefferson and Adams. Everybody else was a tier below Washington, okay, and even Franklin. They were the top of the pyramid, or of the mountaintop. But Jay is a significant figure, and he's going to come on a little bit. We're not going to have him on Mount Rushmore or anything like that. But by the way, it is startling when you come down here. You see all that stuff around the Washington Monument. It's like. Anyway, but I'm an Adams guy.
Thank you.
My question is, I've never understood this. Here's the British fleet, I don't know how many hundreds, whatever, sitting in New York Harbor.
Yeah.
and the representatives of New York are asked to sign a document of independence.
Right.
They must have been scared out of their lives that
Were.
those guns were going to
New
cut
York
loose.
New York doesn't vote for it until the 13th.
And by that time, what happened?
A provisional government gets set up in Fishkill and claims to speak for the people of New York.
I see. So that's the answer.
And there are certain people who signed the document late. Like, there's a signing ceremony on the 2nd, but there are people signing it in October and November, and many of those people are from New York. Okay? Like a couple of them, you know, like they're late, very late, and they sign at the top. A little deceptive. Good question, sir. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Bob Cohen. I've taught several courses based on 2 of your books. So, the Washington in 1779-80 was becoming increasingly despondent about the course of the war,
Yeah.
and
It's a roller coaster. It really is. Yeah.
war weariness and so forth. So the question is, would Washington and his army been in real trouble without the French Navy?
Oh, yeah.
And
Well,
so
without the
was
French
that,
army, too.
Well, the French
Yeah,
army
yeah,
too, but
but
both.
Yorktown is a perfect storm, benevolent for, you know, the French Navy happens to show up off the coast of Tidewater at just the right time, and Cornwallis deposits himself there with his 7,700 troops. Yeah. One of the things people don't know about is that Washington said, okay, we got to rush down there and get them, okay? They don't have any engineers. Only the French have engineers, by the way. Mm-hmm. They don't have the money to get the troops down there. Mm-hmm. And the guy that's superintendent of finance, a guy called Robert Morris, who's one of the wealthiest guys in America, writes personal checks to the tune of $680,000 to get them down. That's real money back then, too. And to get them down there. Mm-hmm. And so it underlined one of the reasons Washington is so depressed in 79-80 is because the states are not meeting their quotas in terms of men or money. Mm-hmm. He says, and I think he's right, we could have raised an army of 150,000. We could have ended the war in a year. But the states don't do that. The states take care of themselves. They pay more money to militia in the respective states. They are fearful of a standing army. They don't want the Continental Army to be too big. And if you're living where the Continental Army is quartered, you're in deep doo-doo because they're going to take everything from you. Mm-hmm. I mean, all your cattle and all this stuff. But there's a natural, one of the things that happens at the end of the war, you take a look at the way they treat the Continental Army. It's awful. No pensions, no back pay, go home and become beggars. Mm-hmm. It's really awful. Mm-hmm. It's a disgrace. Right. And then you get the myth of the militia, you know, like the militia won the war. Oh, what a joke. I mean, the militia, the great thing the militia could do was run away. And that was a good thing because they couldn't be captured because they were gone, you know?
But do you think that Washington could have won without the French involvement?
Yes, eventually, but it would have taken longer. Okay. The French involvement is absolutely crucial, and he would say that, okay? 2/3 of the troops at Yorktown were French troops. But if it weren't Yorktown then, it was going to be something else down the road. The British were losing, you know, the other thing the French involvement did is it forced the British to be fighting globally against the French in the Caribbean and in Europe as well. So the resources were drained in North America. And so that was a huge, big deal. We owe the French. Of course, we paid, you know, we got them back in World War II, and I mean, and it saved them. I think it's their turn now.
Well, I'll ask two, and you only have to answer one.
How come everybody gets two? I mean, you know,
and they're somewhat related.
All right.
So
make them related.
The Declaration. How much is the Declaration of Independence, and at the same time, the creation of state constitutions that no longer that bar oaths of allegiance to the king? How much are those the beginning of the defense against a trial for treason, so that it's the question of starting a new nation, which gives you a leg up on not getting hung for treason? And
It's not a new nation, though.
Well,
That's where I disagree with what you're saying.
Well, I'm just saying the legalities of a nation, whether it's a nation or not,
Well,
is really irrelevant.
we established the legalities of a nation in 1787-88. Okay? But there is no nation even yet. It's a roof without walls. It's a framework for a national government before there is a nation. There really isn't a nation until after the Civil War. After the War of 1812, you get nationalistic stuff, but that we're reading back 20th century values into a 18th century context, and in that sense, it's not accurate.
Okay, I'll leave the nation thing aside.
And you've got to kind of you're a lawyer.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's why
I'm sorry for that. That was a low blow. And
I see the Declaration as the first
but
step.
go ahead, ask your other question.
Well, my question is the Declaration the first step in a treason defense?
Well, okay, all right.
Was it perceived as that by any historian?
Is that your second question?
No, my second question is, how did Thomas Jefferson and Tom Paine, one in England, one in rural Virginia, although educated at Williamsburg, both end up writing clear English when everybody else at the time is writing either sort of the archaic John Adams English or the polite circumventions of gentleman's English?
I wouldn't completely agree on the characterization of Adams. Adams's pamphlets are legalistic and constitutional. His letters are as good as Jefferson's. His letters with Abigail I get George. Yeah, his letters are 1,600 the best letters in the English language. And when I used to have students read the Adams-Jefferson correspondence in the twilight years, 1812 to 1826, most everybody thinks when they come at it, oh, Jefferson's going to be the great stylist, right? They end up just thinking Adams is just as good. And I had this one student who later went on to be head of Showtime say, this is Jefferson. This is Adams. Okay?
Yes.
And it's a comparison of two really different mentalities and styles. But God knows where Paine's came from. It's just God-given, you know. Paine was a corset maker in some town in England. He did nothing right. He married and failed at that. He failed at every job he had. And he comes to America, and he's got a letter from Franklin. 2 years later, he writes the most famous pamphlet in American history. And it's just a gift.